There's more to combat in Warhammer 40k than just getting stuck in. In this video, I share the 3 things that have had the biggest impact to my games in the charge and fight phase. Hello and welcome to Incursion Events. Today I will mostly be talking about the fight phase. No, the charge phase. Or both actually. First and foremost, we need to be thinking about setting up our charges. But before we make it into combat, we need to decide if we should make it into combat. Sounds philosophical, right? What I mean is, do we actually need to charge? Often it's fun, thematic, it's why we play the game to get stuck in, have a good scrap, but we should be considering what is to be gained from charging, where our units can end up after the fight, how that's going to impact mission objectives. It's fun to murder things, but if our unit will score more points holding an objective elsewhere, maybe it's more important to do that. Once we've thought about pros and cons of charging and we've decided to charge, there's one more question we need to ask ourselves. And no, it's not do we feel lucky, it's how many CP does our opponent have? If the answer is more than 0, we need to be mindful of a number of fun tricks that they could have in store for us. These 3 core stratagems are enough to ruin anyone's day. The most immediate one is Fire Overwatch. Overwatch is essentially a free out-of-sequence shooting attack. If we can avoid our opponents getting a shot on our units, particularly if they've got things that automatically hit like flamers, then that will help our survivability and activeness in combat. There's absolutely no point giving our opponents effectively an extra activation of their units. Terrain continues to be our friend in the charge phase. We don't need line of sight to an enemy to charge, so when we're moving to set up charges, we need to always be wary of potential overwatch. Even if we can't stay completely out of sight, if we can make efforts to stay out of range enough so that only a handful of the opponent's models in a unit can overwatch and the rest are out of range, that might make it just unappealing enough that they don't want to spend the CP to overwatch us. Mitigate this as much as you can and you'll have a greater success in the combat phase. Again, if they have CP for it, or access to an ability to use this for free, we want to stay out of range of Heroic Intervention range. It's 2 CP, it's quite expensive to do. Heroic Intervention works after you've moved a charging unit. If the opponent has something within 6 inches of your charging unit, then they can get a free counter charge. It's quite likely if you're within 6 that they'll roll a sufficient number, so they don't need to roll very much. So don't take the risk if we can avoid being out of range of that Heroic Intervention threat. A really good habit to get into is understanding if our opponent has Heroic Intervention CP and making sure we stay outside of 6 when we're moving in for the charge. And there's no reason to give away a free activation to our opponents. Just being really crystal clear with your movement and saying, I'm outside of 6 here, there's no way you're going to Heroic Intervention. So we're being very intentional with our movement so that there's no frustrations by these stratagems. Lastly, the counter-offensive, commonly referred to as the interrupt. If we've got 2 units that we're charging in, when we activate one, our opponent would have an opportunity for 2 CP to interrupt before our second unit would normally strike first, and this can be really brutal if we're planning a sequence of events which says we're going to charge in with our units and smash up whatever was on these 2 objectives. Then if our opponent's got 2 CP stored away and says, oh, I'm just going to interrupt now and wipe out or significantly damage that unit before it gets to strike, that can really change up how the turn plays out for us, and is a key stratagem to be thinking of. If our opponents have 2 CP, this is more often than not what they'll end up saving CP for, as if we have been very clever and thoughtful with our movement getting into combat, we've avoided being overwatched, and we've avoided a Heroic Intervention, we've denied the opportunity for our opponent to spend those CP, so it's very likely that they'll have them banked for counter-offensive. Now, a next level of thinking could be you want to bait an overwatch to prevent a counter-offensive. I mean, that brings me back to the whole point of this tip in the first place, which is to plan your charge through. If you can see your opponent has a finite amount of CP, the initial school of thought is very much, right, let's avoid being overwatched, let's avoid being Heroic Intervention and get the movement right and stop those horrible things happening to our units before we get the chance to strike. Well, actually, if we've charged 2 units in and they've got some really nasty, powerful combat output, maybe actually we're more scared of counter-offensive and they do more damage to us in combat. So perhaps then we're a bit more carefree with our movement. We decide, you know what, I'm just going to move. You can overwatch if you want, my friend. And you know that if they've only got 2 CP, they can either overwatch or counter-offensive or Heroic Intervention. They can't do more than one of those things, and so that's going to affect how we move as well, the total amount of CP that they've got and what we're more afraid of. It can feel like a lot, but having an understanding of all three of these stratagems as we're charging in is really, really important. And also defensively as well. If we're on the receiving end of a charge and our opponent gives us an easy overwatch, take a moment to think, whoa, is this bait? Maybe they want to try and weather a bit of damage to prevent our more nasty combat units getting that counter-offensive in, or perhaps it was the heroic intervention. Just planning a little bit, whether you're on the offensive or the defensive, and thinking about, if I do this stratagem, what does that mean in the later stages of combat, and vice versa. Ultimately, our actions in the charge phase should be heavily influenced on the CP that our opponent has or that we have. It feels awful when we're going to go from, I'm going to wipe out that unit in combat, to, we just died to Overwatch. If I'd moved an inch to the left there, that unit couldn't have got a heroic intervention. I just attacked with my tankier unit first and I've just lost a really fragile unit to a counter-offensive. If I just attacked with the fragile unit first, I would have done damage with them before they got hit back. I see many charge and fight phases sort of rush through, naturally wanting to play smoothly and shortcut so we have a nice quick game, and there's nothing wrong with that. We can still do that, but make sure we have a plan that factors in the key stratagems to avoid any horrible gotcha moments and unravelling of plans, and ultimately prevent us from throwing away units needlessly. This next one is subtle. For that reason, I almost didn't mention it, but this is something that can come up occasionally, and when it does, it's really, really important, and hopefully you'll have a bit of a light bulb moment like I did, where you think, okay, it's actually a very subtle distinction that is useful to be aware of. You may be thinking, as I've referred to the charge and fight phase, what's he talking about? I just kind of thought of it as the crumping phase, the combat phase. What's the distinction here? Well, there is actually a difference between them. Combat ultimately consists of the charge phase and then the fight phase. The charge phase being the bit where we select a unit to charge, roll the charge move, and then repeat that for all our charges and do the physical moving of units into combat or into engagement range. And then the fight phase, which is the punchy bit. Right, that unit's going to fight, and then resolving the to hit roll, the to wound roll, etc. The reason I make this distinction is there are all sorts of things that get triggered in the charge phase or the fight phase, and a solid understanding of the distinction between those two things and the timing of certain things is really, really important. One example of this is tank shock. This is something that occurs in our charge phase. So if we're thinking about our opponent having an interrupt stratagem and we've got something that can tank shock, we can potentially mitigate the threat of something like counter-offensive as we do damage before our opponents can interact. As the counter-offensive stratagem is activated in the fight phase, tank shock is something that we unleash in the charge phase, so we move our units in and run them over, do some nasty damage. Perhaps that counter-offensive stratagem has a little bit less appeal now. There's all sorts of other abilities that units might have as well which trigger at these different points. Chaos Spawn, they get to heal at the end of every phase if they haven't been killed, so tank shock versus a Chaos Spawn actually might not be that appealing. Because say you roll not quite enough to kill it, then actually the stratagem has done flat nothing. It's not even going to be keeping those wounds on that spawn until the end of the fight phase, because at the end of the charge phase it will heal. There are all sorts of little timings and abilities that occasionally crop up that can have these weird sort of effects in the game, and they're very rare sort of moments, but these are the sorts of things that I found as I was learning 10th edition. It was sometimes confusing when people would sort of responding in what I thought was the combat phase. Once you just sort of get your head around that they're two distinct phases and the timing, really get that down, it helps to formulate how things work and can avoid any weird incidental gotchas. Again, just understanding there's two distinct phases and that affects the timing of certain things can have some big ramifications when these moments do crop up. And the last one is movement. This is a big one. Once I wrapped my noodle around this, it unlocked so much potential for me in my games. The charge and the fight phase is free movement. You get up to 2d6 inches extra movement on the charge, and then some pylons. This is a significant amount of extra distance that we could potentially cover with our units. We should be using this movement to the absolute max every time we're charging. And sometimes I will charge units that are on objectives, not because I feel like I can win the combat, but because I can get lots of objective control models onto an objective and steal it from my opponent. We roll our 2d6 and we move every model that, if it can get into base to base with the enemy models, has to. And so once we've achieved that, any remaining models that we have that are not able to get into base to base can move up to that full distance. So a common thing that I see people do is they get base to base, then they realise that the ones sort of at the back of the unit can't quite make it to base, so they just push them up behind their units without really thinking. It's a natural kind of thing, but actually if there are objectives or other enemy units off to the side or a different direction, you can move your other models laterally to get closer to other things, other objectives or units that you want to get to after the fight. So as long as you're moving models that can get base to base with the enemy and getting base to base with those models, the rest of them have a bit more freedom to fully maximize that. You might have an enemy unit that's just in front of an objective and you've rolled really high on the charge. If you've got enough movement to then get the other side of that model, as long as you get base to base with every model that can, you've got that freedom to then move around. I've seen people, they'll roll a charge range and they'll roll like a 12 on the charge, even though they're 2 or 3 inches away from an enemy unit, and they will only move 2 or 3 inches to get in base contact with the enemy, thinking that's what they have to do, whereas they could wrap around the other side of it, they could string the back of the unit out. Another way of thinking about it is if I said to you in the movement phase, you've got to get all the way across the other side of the board, you've got a 12-inch movement, but used 2 or 3 inches of it this turn, you'd think I was mad. But for some reason, when people roll charges and part of the movement can be forgotten in the cut and thrust of getting into close combat, it is sometimes overlooked. And so it's a really good habit just to think, right, I've rolled this, what's the biggest distance I can? And talk with your opponent as well. Just say, look, I want to maximize my movement here. I think this model can go here, base to base, base to base. That's my intention, to get the most out of this movement. And just have a conversation. Again, be really clear and concise with what your intent is and get the most out of the movement. And that applies to pile-ins as well. As long as you can see here with the pile-ins, every model that moves has to end closer to the closest enemy model. As long as you're meeting those requirements, again, you can move around to other parts of the board. Don't just go the minimum amount you need to do to get into combat. And the same goes with the consolidation move. Every model has the potential to then get another bit of free movement. If the models in our units could end base to base with another unit, then we have to do that. And of course the unit has to stay in unit coherency and within range, engagement range, of at least one enemy unit if possible. If that's not possible, then we can leapfrog towards an objective. So if we have wiped a unit out and we're within 3 inches of an objective, we can move on to that objective. The two plays that I will see observing tournament games is people will go into combat, they'll fight, and they're already in combat, so they'll just sort of look at the board and go, well, I don't need to pile in, I'm already in combat. Whereas actually they could have maybe, after the combat, piled in a couple of models just to get further up the board for later turns, or just pile in more models so that you get more models onto an objective to add their OC to that objective and deny their opponent scoring it in the subsequent turn, for example. Essentially, whilst there are restrictions to how you move when you make the charge, pile-in and consolidation moves, it's really worth just reading through those restrictions, really understanding them, and thinking about how we can move in these phases of the game to really maximise the distance we can cover and get the most out of that free bit of movement. In short though, viewing the charge and the fight phases not just as the punchy, but as ways of getting to other parts of the board. It's a little bit like a second movement phase, and once we view it as such, it allows us to see places we didn't actually think we would be able to necessarily reach, which is really important when we need to score primary points or secondary points. And there we have it. These are the 3 most impactful things that have really leveled up my games of 40k, and I hope that there's been some really useful insight. In summary, we want to think about how we set up the charge. Do we want to charge? Is there something that's going to give us more victory points or secondary victory points elsewhere in the game? Once we've identified that we do want to be charging, count up the CP on both sides of the board. What tricks and traps are your opponent going to have? Heroic Intervention, Overwatch, Counter-Offensive, they're the big ones, but there's all sorts of other things, and I've talked about it before. Going to sound like a broken record, but conversation with your opponent. Understand, what defensive abilities have you got? What out of sequence stuff have you got? Is there something you can do to move further away from me? That would be really devastating if you set up a move to charge an enemy unit only to learn it can move away in the charge phase. So understand what sort of shenanigans are going to be in play and set up your plan accordingly. Understanding the timing and the subtle differences between the charge and the fight phase. It can be quite devastating if someone reveals that the timing of what you want to do doesn't quite work out in the way that you were expecting. So understand the distinction between the charge phase, the fight phase, and the timings of what you want to unleash in the combat. And lastly, the charge phase and the fight phase are like little movement phases. Use that free movement to get where we need to be, leapfrog onto objectives, or threaten units that think they might be safe by piling in towards them and really putting the pressure on our opponent and really leveraging that free bit of movement. If you found all this helpful, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with future videos. It's been really fun going through the different phases of the game and sharing my experiences, and the next video is going to be all about core stratagems and how to leverage those. So I touched on a few things here already, but there's plenty more to get through. Also, if you're thinking about getting involved in Warhammer tournaments, then check out the video description below to find out more about the events that I'm hosting in the south of England. Also in the description is how to be featured in my community spotlight videos. The first one was great fun, had an awesome chat with Jack Masters all about his goths. Jack is the winner of Throne of Skulls 2023 and a fantastic commission painter as well as an awesome community leader. It's well worth checking out the video and listening to how he's painted his amazing orc army. So check it out and get in touch if you want to be involved. Until next time, keep rolling those dice, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.